I have been painting a lot of sea-themed pieces lately, as well as, in particular, a lot of jellyfish. And so I've gotten some questions lately on how to paint jellyfish. These are just a few of the ones from a recent painting. This is called Surge. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Let's start with how to draw them. I'm going to be showing you this on a digital tablet just for ease of erasing and drawing things and showing you how the structure is. Okay, so a jellyfish. It is basically a parachute shaped thing, right? Creature in general. Very quick drawing. But this is basically what we're dealing with. Now, the shape of it, the body, it's basically a parachute type thing, right? And it holds liquid inside, and to move, it propels itself by squeezing the liquid out. So when it's moving forward, its body is more of its domed lump shape, right? And when it is in this sort of relaxed phase where it's just drifting after all the liquid has been squeezed out from that central area, then it's more of this elongated, flattened shape. And the tendrils are going to give you motion and movement. So you're going to be able to tell which way, which direction your jellyfish has come from by the flowing movement of these little tentacle tendrils. You see, it gives it a sense of flow and movement and composition by doing that. What you don't want to do is to create a confusion of direction by having your tendrils go every which way. And you can have some like that and some like this. Now this is giving too much information and too many conflicting directions of motion. That's not what it's going to look like. You don't really see any propulsion here happening. It's just everything waving and drifting. What you want to do instead is limit the direction of your flow. And there can be some variation. I mean, it doesn't all have to be in this exact same mirrored arc. In fact, you don't want something like that because that looks artificial. There are currents and movements and tiny eddies of liquid and water flowing. So there is going to be some variation in the way these curl and move. But you want to make sure you have an overall direction of movement. You see, this now gives you a sense that it is moving upward in this curved movement. Another thing to keep in mind is that all these little tendrils, well, first of all, actually, let's talk about this thing. This domey, parachute-y segment of the body. It's basically like a mushroom cap. This is what we're dealing with as far as the physical shape goes. In fact, it is very much like a cap. Okay? You're going to have this rim at the bottom and the upper dome part. It's just much more curved than this jar lid I'm using as an example is. Oh, here's something else that looks more jellyfish shaped. It's a little basket. But this is what you want to have. And so this is the geometrical form and shape that you are trying to create in various configurations. As I pointed out earlier, sometimes it can be much more of a sharp dome, and sometimes it could be much more of a flattened disc, depending on what phase of movement the jellyfish is in. Also, some of them might have more of this little lip edge instead of an inward concave curve. It might go a little bit convex. Sometimes you might see a shape like this. Now, all of these shapes and forms right now that I've drawn here are mostly seen at this angle. You can also have it, of course, at this angle, seen from the top. But even so, when you're looking at it from the top, keep in mind the curvature of the edges. And as well, think of the way the tendrils are going to fall off of that edge now. And speaking of those tendrils, tentacles, this is something that I was doing very roughly initially on the first few jellyfish that I was showing you, but they come off of the edges, off the edge of this lip. Whatever shape your jellyfish has, this is where the fringe comes off of. Some jellyfish actually don't really have very many visible tentacle-y things at all. Some of them are just like this. I think those are called moon jellyfish. Can't remember. And they have like a little portion of their body inside here where they feed on stuff. All right, so that's just a quick little bit about how to draw jellyfish and thinking about how their bodies are formed, the physical shape of it, so that we can keep these elements in mind when you start to paint and when you start to create shading and try to craft volume for these bodies. So let's take that now to real pencil and paper as well as paint. We are going to start now with this jellyfish that I have drawn onto my watercolor paper and taped down to a surface. And I just use a mechanical pencil, HB lead generally. And this is a kneaded eraser now. I'm going to use that to lighten up some of my lines. Because my jellyfish is going to be mostly glowy white, I do not want too many pencil lines, graphite, darkening that. Generally, if I was doing this without a video, I would lighten this even further, but I'm not going to do that right now because if I do that, you're not going to be able to see anything at all. Now, the first thing I do is I start to wet the areas around my jellyfish, being careful not to paint over the tendrils with my water, which can be slightly crazy making, but that's why we do art, isn't it? I'm going to show you the crazier method first, which is avoidance. This is something that I talked about in my last month's video for how to maintain white areas. Just simply not painting them. And then I'm going to go through the cheaty methods, which is where you can use some opaque white. And actually, you know, jellyfish tendrils are actually a very good place to do something like that. This is just clean water that I'm brushing around the outskirts of my jellyfish. And I'm not going to do everything right now because it's going to start drying if I do. So I'm only doing the upper portion right now. And now I'm going to take some ultramarine blue and drop that in. And let it spread in the wet areas that I have created. And get some more intense color there. And as you see, the paint does not spread into the areas that I did not initially wet. It stays within the zones that I put water on. I'm going to do a little bit of wet on wet with some other tones. This is a Daniel Smith ultramarine turquoise, just to add a little bit of interest with other colors. And I'm doing wet on wet, which means that my surface is wet, and I'm also adding more liquid at the same time, liquid and pigment, and this just lets things kind of spread out and interact. The pigment interact and pool and create interesting textures. Now these finer areas, amidst all the tentacles and things, you notice I did not go into there yet. I'm going to do that now with a much finer brush. That was a size 4 that I was initially using, and I'm going to switch to something, let's see, this is a size 2, it's a synthetic, that's the only size 2 I can find on hand right now, and I'm also going to zoom in so you can get a better look at this detail. Alright, I actually found a Winsor Newton Series 7 Kolinsky Sable size 1 brush that I will be using. Here's my ultramarine blue, and I'm going to try to match the intensity level that I have on this outer area. As I slowly and painstakingly paint around each and every one of these little tentacles. And what I'm doing is avoiding painting the actual white tentacle itself. I'm painting into the negative space that surrounds each of them. And my brush is, it's not super wet or loaded with pigment. It's kind of a midway loaded up. Enough to do a nice glazing. And this is why I was erasing and lightening up my pencil lines initially. Because as you see, each of these tentacles is actually defined by that quick little pencil line sketch. And so I don't want to have my pencil too dark, otherwise it wouldn't be white, the result of this. You would see instead just gray graphite, not as interesting or effective. Now you see it as I got to the bottom here, as I got to this part, I didn't match my outer tone very well with my inner tone. What I'm talking about with outer and inner tone, I'm just talking about this outer wet on wet area that I painted initially. And these little inner spaces now that I am doing with my smaller brush and more carefully. I need to make it match the outside area, because if I don't, it will look like it is a cutout. And so here I'm doing another bit of glaze along the outside just to match the much darker tones that I had along this area. And so I just keep doing this as I make my way across all these intricate little tendrils. Now it's possible to also do this via masking fluid. You could, instead of painting around all these little tiny details, instead just paint them all out with masking fluid, and then you just do like a giant wash on top of everything, and you don't have to worry about staying in these little sectioned areas at all, because the masking fluid would protect your whites for you. However, I just generally don't like to use masking fluid because I don't like, sometimes it doesn't come off your paper very well. It'll leave a little bit of a residue, or sometimes it leaves hard edges as your liquid paint comes up against the edges of it and creates a bit of a pooling effect. And so you end up with much more variation than I even get this way with my individual areas being painted. But also, I think this is good practice to learn how to avoid painting in areas in general, because this is the essence really of what watercolor is. It's about learning to paint in some areas and avoiding others. And the ability to do that, whether it's for small little details like this or for the much larger scope of your overall painting, is going to come in pretty handy. It's going to be an important element and an important aspect of your whole painting experience. So really, once you have the confidence to be able to do something like this, then you can handle most anything else as well in watercolors. And really, this just takes patience and forethought. Have to know that this is what I want to, this is the effect that I want to create. And I want these white little glowy tendrils against a dark blue background, and so this is what is involved in that process. This is what it takes. I am going to do a time lapse for the rest of this section here, where I'm going to basically do the same thing that you've been watching me doing here in real time, but I'm just going to speed it up because it's a lot of the same thing. And then we'll get to some other interesting elements where I'll talk some more. All right. So here we go, speeding things up. Another thing that I did here was that I just took some clean water with a large brush. Doesn't really matter what kind of brush. This is a size 8 synthetic, and it's kind of an old one. You can see by the splayed bristles. And all I did was I took some water and I brushed over portions that I wanted to blend and smooth and have more integrated with the surrounding colors and tones. And I did this because when you're painting all these individual little areas, as I did, all these negative space areas, you get variations of tone, and you might not have complete consistency across from one zone to the next. And what this does, this is essentially lifting. And as I've spoken about in other videos, some colors lift better than others, and this is ultramarine blue that I've been using in this painting, so it lifts actually very well. And what happens is that when you brush water over it lightly like this, it is lifting the colors and sort of spreading out the pigment across all the areas that I'm doing this to. So you don't want to overdo it, because if you do too much of this, then you're going to lose the intensity of your tones. But I'm doing it just enough to sort of get things blended a bit. And I'm going to actually lift much more intentfully over here in this upper area of the jellyfish's body to have that meld out into the surrounding water better. Soften the edge. Leave it not so much of a hard edge line delineating from my painted blue to my unpainted white. And that gives it much more of a glow effect when it's this soft light. I also added a little bit more wet and wet green and yellow tones at the bottom just for some interest, giving this painting something more than just the blues. And all I'm doing here is continuing to lift a little bit along the edge just to give it more of that glow effect. And same with a few of those tendrils over there and over here. Once everything has gotten to a dry state, now I can begin to do some detail shading and sculpting of the forms. So now I'm moving into a size 0 brush and doing dry brush to get some fine shading of forms. And what I'm doing here is I am adding more dark blue to the outer edges of the jellyfish's body, because this is the translucent part of its body. You can sort of see through it. So you're seeing the blue of the water through things. And the whiter areas, as in the center over here, those are actually the areas where you are not seeing through the body. You're seeing more of what's going on in here, these tentacles and tendrils and things. And so that's why it looks white. So you have to think of the shape that you're trying to craft and sculpt. And this is why I was talking about how the structure was initially before we even started painting. This is generally how I like to approach my subject matter, whether or not it's a real thing where I can have a physical specimen to study in front of me, like some of the botanical art that I do, or when it's completely fantasy and fantastical. I try to wrap my brain around how the structure is. And if there is no actual physical thing that I can look at and reference, I find the closest approximation to that and try to understand how it moves, what makes it move, what, in this case, I was talking about how the body pulsates and squeezes in order to push liquid out. That's important in order to understand how you draw it and how the shading and sculpting of the form works when you get to these stages, or even in the early drawing stages, in fact. This big fat tendrily thing that goes down the center. I should probably look up what all these parts of the jellyfish are called, rather than just referring to them as fat tendrily things or long skinny tendrily things. But you guys know what I'm talking about, right? You understand what I'm referring to in this. As I'm painting this section, I have to keep in mind that some of these thin tendrils are drifting down in front as well. And that's why there's sort of this scattered approach to the shading, and still this negative space sculpting that I'm doing. As we get down to the bottom here, you notice that it actually sort of faded out into the surrounding areas. I'm going to switch things up. All the way in this upper area, we've been doing the negative space is the darker, and now I'm going to switch things so that it's the positive space that's the dark, and the negative space is the light, so that the background is actually lighter than the object, the physical element that is being painted in the foreground. This is also something that keeps interest level up in a painting. Makes things much more complicated, but in a good way. when you switch back and forth between positive and negative space in a drawing and a painting, and which elements are dark and which elements are light, flip-flopping that. I mean, you do have to pay attention to how it is positioned and why you are doing that. I mean, you don't want to just all of a sudden switch something from dark to light, positive space, positive, negative space, without an actual reason for it. And in this case, the reason for it would be because I have this lighter area coming in the background from the bottom versus the darker area in the top. So, you know, if light is coming from down here or even over here, this portion of the jellyfish now is going to be shaded, or the white elements are now going to appear dark. I'm doing all this still with my size 0 brush. What I'm also going to do is add in some of the lines for the tendrils that attach to the back side of the jellyfish body. See, all the ones that you're seeing here, these white glowy ones, are the ones that are attaching to this front curve. But there's also this back curve that we don't see. And so these are the ones that are coming from that area. And I'm just doing these freehand, but you notice that I'm still maintaining that curvature and flow, this upward movement. You have to be consistent about things like that. And I think we're pretty much complete here now. Just doing a few more of these little tendrils, and it is done. Jellyfish. Glowy white jellyfish. What's that, you say? All that negative space painting makes your head spin? All right, so this is the easier way. I'm going to start off just painting a wash. I'm just doing this ultramarine blue and some green. Doesn't matter what I use, just want to get nice coverage on the page. This tiny little piece. And make sure that it is dark because you're going to need contrast. Things are not quite dry. You can see there's a little bit of a gloss there of liquid still. And I am taking a Uniball Signo UM153 gel, white gel pen. And I am simply going to draw my jellyfish. Same as I drew it out earlier. And now I'm going to take a little bit of liquid on a brush, a small brush, and blend things out. This is why I started while my paper was still a tiny bit wet, because it makes this blending process easier. And in fact, I'm going to take a larger brush along the bottom area to really blend that in, so that the places where I lifted my pen up are not so obvious. Instead, it simply shifts into the surrounding background. Also, this gives everything more of that fuzzy glow effect that I was talking about earlier as well, with the larger jellyfish that I did. And go back and forth a little bit. Sometimes I add a little bit more white, do a little bit more blending. I like this Uniball Signo pen because it's really nice and opaque. Other gel pens, there's a variety of brands. Sometimes they're not as opaque, and sometimes they dry out really easily, and you get one or two usages out of them and then you can't use them anymore. That's always really frustrating. But I've been using this particular brand for maybe 10 years now, or actually probably longer than that, with fairly good results in all that time. It uses a lot of the ink is the one thing, so if you use them you do end up needing a lot of them, but for what it does I think it is very effective. And it's not like I use a ton of white in my paintings anyway. For the most part I try to stick to the technique that I did for the other larger jellyfish that I showed you. But sometimes this can be really effective too. Especially in this case where I wanted, this really dark background, and then you have this very subtly glowy looking ethereal creature in the midst of that. All right, there you go. There's the quick and easy version. See, I added a few more jellyfish using this method along the edges over here. And there you go. Jellyfish. Hope you enjoyed watching this. If you have questions about what you would like to see me approach next in some of my future videos, please feel free to contact me and leave comments or email me. Let me know what you'd like to see, what you would like me to discuss and talk about. Happy to do that. Happy to receive emails as well. And I want to thank all the members of my Patreon, all the subscribers who help to make these videos possible and who help to support the creation of them. If you're interested, you can find me at www.patreon.com/Stephanie Law.